This idea of shame, of being ashamed of the past, does not exist in Russia today. The only shame that Vladimir Putin talks about is the dissolution of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century.
Can you sort of describe the difference between the myth of World War II, which Putin has created, versus reality?
I mean, I think it's interconnected with a lot of the narrative that people have in terms of their understanding, one, of the Soviet Union, and two, just in general, of the role it has played in the second part of the 20th century, and then how today it's in some way permissible or acceptable to sort of pardon some of the heinous crimes that were committed against the people in the Soviet Union due to several factors. Putin, of course, needs this in a way, this victory cult that he has created. He needs this in order for his own people to accept the terrible conditions that they're still living under, this authoritarian state. It justifies in a large way what's being done now, in that it unifies people against the fight. If we recall, in the beginning of the special military operation against Ukraine, there was this talk of denazification of Ukraine, which to everyone who knew anything about Ukraine really meant de-Ukrainization of Ukraine. But again, it's just conjuring up these old images that the regime in Moscow needs in order to bring people together and to have them overlook the hardships that they're enduring because of his foolhardy stewardship, one, of the economy, and two, of politics in terms of relations with his neighbors. And now, of course, which has meant the incredible sanctions that the Western countries have put against him. So I think the World War II myth, and even the language that we hear, the Great Patriotic War, and even the dates. I mean, you talk to anybody outside of Russia today, and you ask them the dates of World War II, and everyone will say 1939, 1945. You say that on the streets of Moscow, and you risk getting arrested or you risk getting put in prison.
And what are the sort of main things that Putin's version of World War II omit?
First of all, I think there's very little mention of the fact that without the Lend-Lease of the United States, both Stalin and later Khrushchev even agreed to this, that without this material assistance, the Soviets would have lost the war. There's no mention of that in any case, in any way today. In fact, when recently Donald Trump said that the United States made this incredible contribution to ending World War II, the reaction of Dmitry Medvedev was, malarkey, right? They didn't do anything. But I think if you look at it recently, I remember in the article when I had written it, it was estimated about 160 billion US dollars. Those estimates have been upped now. I'm hearing numbers of about 250, the equivalent of today of $250 billion of material, of which, interestingly, only I think about $700 million was ever repaid by the Soviet Union and ultimately by Russia. In 2006, I think they made the final payment on these materials. So the superiority, obviously, of the Soviet Union. I mean, the Soviet Union was just built on myths anyway. It's about lies, deception, manipulation, and there was no honesty, there was no openness on the part of the society, nor was there any expected on the part of the people. The classic stories of you had to increase milk production, you just added water, you increased your milk production, and you got a medal. You were a hero. I think that people began to realize that this. If I could sort of make an anecdote and say, I remember speaking to a relative of mine, asking him, how was it that you survived, living in during Soviet times? I mean, you're just such an honest and open person. And he told me, he said, Andrej, it was very simple. You had to think one thing, say another, and do a third. That was the modus servendi, if you like, of the Soviet times. So reality was not a concept that was very much touted during the times of the Soviet Union, nor is it touted today during the times of the Russian Federation, during the regime of Vladimir Putin. So one, and two, if you amplify the so-called greatness of the Red Army, of the Soviet forces, you also are able to conveniently whitewash all of the terrible crimes that were committed against the people in the lands in which they were. Of course, all of this the West turned a blind eye to because of the famous dictum, that's the winners who write history, right? So this is something too, I think, that every nation has to and should make a serious evaluation of their past and come to terms and realize that what was being done at the time may have been done because they felt that was the only option they had, or they felt this was the best thing they could be doing. But looking back today, obviously, we realize in most democratic nations that there are moments in our history that we can be proud of, and there are certainly moments in our history we can be ashamed of. This idea of shame, of being ashamed of the past, does not exist in Russia today. The only shame that Vladimir Putin talks about is the dissolution of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. Whereas I always try to say that the mere existence of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the Soviet Union of the 20th century.
Your support is central to help us keeping the world informed about what's at stake in Ukraine. Consider becoming a member to help the Kyiv Independent provide locally produced journalism from Ukraine to the world. And what about Ukraine's specific contributions to World War II? Because obviously, when Putin remembers the troops that fell during during World War II, he seems to be implying that they were all Russian.
Well, I think we're partly to blame there, Chris. The just general laziness on the part of historians, lack of intellectual curiosity, journalists as well. I mean, the fact that we've been interchanging the term Soviet and Russian, since the end of World War II, or since forever. I mean, this is our fault as well. You talk to the average person, you ask them to distinguish between a Soviet and a Russia, they can't tell you. So anybody who was in the Soviet Union for them was a Russian. I remember as a kid raising my hand during history class saying, yes, but this was not Russia, this was the Soviet Union. And the teacher would say, oh, that's the same thing. So I think we're partly to blame in this case. But yeah, sure. I mean, when it's bad things that are done, they'll talk about the Red Army. We won't talk about Russians. When it's good things for the glory, it's the Soviets or the Russians. So there are sort of little mechanisms that can be used in times if there is some any kind of criticism. Now remember, of course, the fact that the Soviets were able to get away with this during World War II, and the fact that Stalin stood high among the leaders of the time, was respected, I think is just a sense of motivation for Putin to do the same. And the way that the Russian Federation soldiers are acting on the territory of Ukraine, from Bucha to other places. We talk about mass rapes. We talk about all the same things that were being done by Soviet soldiers during World War II. Well, I think the idea is that if we got away with it once, we'll get away with it again. And the sense of impunity, I think, largely is one due to the lack of willingness of the West to highlight this, lack of the willingness of the U.S. to also teach this. I mean, you don't really learn about this in secondary schools or in high schools, about all of the crimes that were committed by the Soviets against their own people or against the people of Central Europe or countries that were then, that were occupied by them. And I think that's something and then for me, the ultimate distinction, I think, always has been that the Western armies were armies of liberation, whereas the Soviet army was just an army of occupation. And that's all the difference in the world for me. And it should be all the difference in the world for everybody else.
You've described the Victory Day celebrations as a cult. Can you just give us an idea of the scale of this day and what it means for the Russian public, today?
This is the pinnacle of the 20th century for the Soviet Union. The fact that they were victors, in this. And anybody who opposes them is a fascist or is a Nazi. This is the underpinning. This is the ultimate weapon that they have in their propaganda toolbox in order to keep people in line, one, and to deflect from criticism from abroad. And I think it was highly symbolic. I believe it was for the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, European end of World War II. Obviously, the war in Asia ended later. But I think the idea is that while they had military parades going in Moscow and Red Square, In Ukraine, you had children presenting drawings and writing poems talking about the end of World War II. And I think this notion of huge military parades with everyone bowing to the supreme leader is not only antiquated, it's just downright dangerous. I don't think this belongs in any kind of society where there is an openness, where there is transparency, or where there is some purported semblance of democracy, which I think nobody really believes there is in Russia today.
You mentioned that you thought that military parades shouldn't have any place in any modern country. It's actually a topic which Donald Trump has mentioned recently. Does that concern you?
Well, I don't think Donald Trump has any place in this century either. But that's my opinion. I mean, the revival of Alcatraz is another example of the antiquated thinking that's going on in the Trump administration today. It sort of shows a desperation. When people can identify with values, when people can identify with what brings us together, you have to have this show of strength. And I think that is a very worrying trend in the sense of what's happening. I think the whole idea of the military parade in the US was just more to commemorate his birthday. It was supposed to be on Donald Trump's birthday than it was to commemorate World War II. So I don't know. It seems like these are all like sort of cheap tricks that people have in their pockets, that leaders have in their pockets. They want to show how strong they are, the strongmen. And obviously, there is an appeal for Donald Trump for strongmen. You've seen that, whether it's Erdogan or whether it's Putin or the other people. He likes those that are respected, that are feared. Maybe not even respected, but more feared than respected. And it comes down to that old line from Caligula about, do you want to be loved or you want to be feared? And I think people who have authoritarian tendencies would rather be feared than be loved. Whereas maybe you and I share an image of the world where we would like to have leaders that we actually appreciate them, and we would like to have them lead and show us an example, then tell us how we should do things or we'll go to prison.
I think to people in like Europe and the US, the idea of being able to like rewrite history on an event as big as World War II just seems almost fantastical. But how effective has that been in Russia in terms of how big this day has become?
Well, I don't think it's a rewrite at all. It's just being amplified and amplified. It's like a crescendo effect. It gets more and more important because it deflects, one, from what's the politics of the current administration or the regime there is, one. And two, it sets it at odds with the Western world. The decadent Western world that we see, that we hear about, the political parties that decry Europe as gay Europa, talking down about how these societies have gone completely over the edge. We need to come back to a more Christian-based, conservative countries and so forth. I think this is playing into that in the sense where people felt this was a time when there was some order or law and order, I don't know, or some authority that was able to keep people in line. The truth is that, hundreds of thousands of their own troops were killed by the Soviets because they were, they defected or they didn't have uniforms and they were turning back and they were just shot in the back of the head. Human life really doesn't have any value in Russia today, nor can you really say it had value during the Soviet times. If you look at the history, whether it was Chernobyl, whether it was the Holodomor, whether it was the way the soldiers were treated that fought in the Second World War, nor did it really have any value during Tsarist times. Peasants were considered to be expendable. People were expendable. And I think that same attitude remains today. And if you look at the demographics of the people who are fighting, you've seen that very often watching pictures of the soldiers that are fighting for Russia in Ukraine. Many of them, they don't come from Moscow, they don't come from St. Petersburg. They're not your traditional Russians in that sense. And I think they come from poor regions where they're offered a lot of money to go to fight for Russia. And this also, in the end, is going to be a huge problem, I believe, for Russia when the war is over, because these people are going to return back to their poor, undeveloped regions with the expectation of being able to get as much money and earn as much as they did during the war, and they're going to come back and live the same life they had before. Nothing will have changed other than the fact that they will have lost, half of the village or half of the people living in the cities where they come from. I mean, we're getting close to, I don't know, you should be more informed than I am, but we're getting close to 1 million casualties for Russia in its war of aggression against Ukraine. So all of this strong connection to the past, this myth of victory, of our finest hour, this becomes ever more relevant with every dying or every lost soldier in Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, because this becomes a justification in terms of showing what we needed to take to make a sacrifice, and we're making that sacrifice again today.
But is there a sort of boundary or a limit on this myth? Would the same mentality allow Russia's expansionist ambitions to go outside Ukraine?
I think the further west you go, the more informed people are in terms of what actually transpired during the Second World War. So I think, or one would hope, I'm not sure. There have been worrying trends in recent elections and recent rise in political parties in countries bordering the former Soviet Union, those that were behind the Iron Curtain. So I don't know. The problem, of course, with all of this is that the longer we are away from the actual event, I mean, there are fewer and fewer survivors of World War II still alive today. Maybe people who were born during the war, people who remember the war, but those who fought in the war, there are very few that are still alive. And that's just a matter of time, of years that have gone by. I think it's harder to understand that, for people in my generation, this was a guiding principle, World War II. The fact that we were able to establish this international order after World War II, the liberal world order, the rule of law, the human responsibilities, human rights that were established because of this. All of this is getting further and further away for people today. They don't have that same frame, that same context to look at this. And this, I think, is a worrying aspect of that. It's important to have sort of an ability to remind people of what has transpired. The danger, of course, is in authoritarian or totalitarian systems. It's very much a pick and choose, sort of à la carte kind of way of looking at it. Whereas I think it's much more balanced in societies where you have democracy and you have the ability to speak and your freedom of speech, where you're able to speak and openly express facts or discuss facts even, whereas in a society where you have one narrative, a myth that is the standard line, I think it's not possible to be able to commemorate these events without the danger of it being instrumentalized.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that interview and found it insightful, you can help us produce more quality content like that. All you have to do is sign up to become a member, and you can do that at kyivindependent.com/membership.